The night was still, save for the rustling of leaves under a gentle breeze, as the grand estate of Silvermont stood silhouetted against a starlit sky. The Hawthorne mansion, with its imposing turrets and vast, illuminated gardens, was a sight to behold, a fortress of luxury and privilege. Yet, inside its gilded walls, a storm brewed, unnoticed by the world outside. Celeste Hawthorne, heir to the sprawling Hawthorne fortune, reclined on a velvet chaise in the opulent parlor. Her emerald silk robe caught the flicker of the fireplace as she idly swirled a glass of red wine. Her manicured nails tapped against the crystal rim, betraying a restlessness that even the grandeur around her couldn't assuage. Her life was a portrait of excess, the kind most people could only dream of. She had grown up amidst ballrooms echoing with laughter, closets brimming with designer gowns, and vaults filled with enough jewels to rival royalty. But tonight, all the wealth in the world couldn't silence the gnawing envy that had taken root in her heart. The source of her discontent was neither a rival heiress nor a social slight. It was Clara Bennet, her maid. Clara, with her serene composure and an air of quiet dignity that seemed out of place in a servant's role, had unwittingly become the bane of Celeste's existence. It wasn't Clara's appearance alone, though her understated beauty did not go unnoticed. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at Celeste in moments of introspection. Clara possessed a kind of inner peace that Celeste, despite all her riches, couldn't claim for herself. And it stung. Celeste drained her glass and set it down with a decisive clink. No, she thought. Clara needed to be put in her place. The idea had been germinating for weeks, ever since Celeste overheard a guest at one of her parties compliment Clara's composure. The comment had been meant innocuously, but it had sent Celeste's mind spinning. How dare a maid, someone who lived off the scraps of her fortune, draw admiration that should have been hers? Her upcoming birthday provided the perfect opportunity. Silvermont's elite would gather in her ballroom, a night to celebrate Celeste Hawthorne in all her glory. And Clara, poor, simple Clara, would be there as the unwitting centerpiece of a plan that would restore the balance in Celeste's favor. A smile tugged at her lips as she rehearsed the scene in her mind. Clara would arrive, dressed in her best attempt at finery, only to find herself out of her depth amidst the glittering crowd. The whispers, the stares, the pity disguised as politeness. It would all serve to remind Clara of her place. "Clara!" Celeste called, her voice slicing through the mansion's quiet. Moments later, Clara appeared in the doorway. She moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had nothing to prove, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Yes, Miss Celeste?" she asked, her tone polite but not obsequious. "I've decided to invite you to my birthday party," Celeste announced, the words dripping with false magnanimity. "You deserve a night off, and I think it would be delightful for you to join us. Dress appropriately, of course." Clara's brow lifted ever so slightly, a subtle sign of surprise that she quickly masked. "That's very kind of you, Miss Celeste. I'll make arrangements." "Good," Celeste said, dismissing her with a wave of her hand. As Clara turned to leave, Celeste's gaze lingered on her. For a fleeting moment, a pang of doubt flickered in her chest, but she quickly dismissed it, focusing instead on the grand humiliation she had orchestrated. At 23 years old, Celeste Hawthorne embodied the archetype of a privileged heiress. Her honey-blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her wardrobe a rotating showcase of the latest couture, and her social calendar filled with exclusive galas and soirees. Yet beneath the polished surface was a young woman grappling with insecurity, her self-worth tied tightly to the adoration of those around her. Celeste craved validation and feared irrelevance, a vulnerability she masked with arrogance and sharp wit. Clara Bennet, on the other hand, was a study in quiet strength. At 29, she had an air of maturity that belied her modest position. Her chestnut-brown hair was often tied back in a practical bun, and her plain uniforms did little to hide her natural elegance. Clara's striking blue eyes held a depth that hinted at untold stories and experiences far beyond the walls of Silvermont. Though reserved, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed unshakable, earning the respect of everyone she encountered. Despite the disparity in their ages, their interactions often felt like a subtle tug of war. Celeste's sharp comments and veiled barbs met with Clara's unflappable demeanor, leaving the heiress frustrated and, though she'd never admit it, slightly awed. Clara's presence was a quiet reminder of everything Celeste lacked: authenticity, resilience, and a sense of purpose. What Celeste didn't know was that Clara's poise came from a life far removed from the opulence of Silvermont. While Celeste had grown up shielded from hardship, Clara's journey had been one of resilience and self-reliance. It was this contrast, Celeste's restless privilege against Clara's grounded humility, that set the stage for the storm brewing between them. Unbeknownst to both, the events of the upcoming party would challenge their perceptions of each other and themselves, reshaping their lives in ways neither could have predicted. In the days leading up to her birthday, Celeste meticulously orchestrated her grand humiliation plan, her excitement growing with each passing moment. The Silvermont Ballroom, a space so vast it could house 100 guests and still leave room for a string quartet, became the centerpiece of her scheme. She envisioned the night as a spectacle of opulence, with Clara's disgrace as the evening's highlight. Celeste gathered her inner circle: Veronica, her equally vain and ambitious best friend, and Theodore, a wealthy young aristocrat with a penchant for gossip. Together, they formed a trio of schemers, their laughter echoing through the Hawthorne estate as they crafted every detail of the plan. "She has to stand out, but not in a way that flatters her," Celeste said, spreading a hand-drawn diagram of the ballroom on her marble coffee table. "We'll position her in the center, directly in the path of everyone's gaze." "And the dress?" Veronica asked, sipping from her flute of champagne. Celeste smirked and gestured to a garment bag resting on the sofa. Inside was a hideous pink gown adorned with outdated frills, mismatched lace, and a neckline so exaggerated it bordered on comical. "This," she said, unzipping the bag to reveal the monstrosity. "I left it in her room this morning with a note. It's impossible to miss." Theodore chuckled. "Darling, you're wicked. She'll look like a costumed extra in a Victorian play." "That's the idea," Celeste replied with a gleam in her eye. "She'll think she's being included, but in reality, she's walking into a lion's den. When she steps into that ballroom, she'll see nothing but polite smiles, hiding disdain." As they refined the plan, Celeste added layers of cruelty. She ensured the seating arrangement placed Clara among the most critical and snobbish guests, those who thrived on dissecting perceived inadequacies. "I want whispers to ripple through the crowd the moment she enters," she declared. "No escape, no relief." The day before the party, Celeste orchestrated a final flourish. She sent one of her maids to deliver a handwritten invitation to Clara's quarters, ensuring it bore a personal touch. The note read, "Dear Clara, it would mean the world to me if you joined the celebration. After all, you've been such an integral part of the Hawthorne estate. I've even picked a dress for you, something to reflect the joyous occasion." It was signed with a flourish, dripping with insincerity. When Clara received the note, her reaction was unreadable. She held the invitation with steady hands, her blue eyes scanning the words before glancing at the gown hanging nearby. Celeste had imagined Clara would feel a mix of gratitude and nerves, unaware of the trap she was stepping into. Yet, there was an air of quiet resolve about Clara that Celeste hadn't anticipated. The evening of the party arrived, and Silvermont transformed into a spectacle of extravagance. Chandeliers cast glittering light over the ballroom, which was adorned with floral arrangements imported from abroad. Waitstaff moved gracefully between guests, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The air buzzed with laughter and the tinkling of glasses as the elite of Silvermont mingled in their finest attire. Celeste stood at the top of the grand staircase, a vision in her emerald gown, surveying the crowd with the air of a queen preparing to make her decree. Beside her, Veronica leaned in, whispering, "Is she coming?" "Any moment now," Celeste replied, her pulse quickening. When Clara finally entered, she did so with the poise of someone used to being invisible. Her pink gown, ill-fitting and outdated, was a stark contrast to the sleek, modern attire of the other women in the room. Conversation dwindled, heads turned, and an awkward silence settled over the ballroom. The corners of Celeste's lips twitched upward. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. "Look at her," Veronica murmured, barely suppressing a laugh. "She looks like a doll from a bargain bin." Theodore leaned closer. "And yet she walks in as if she belongs. Quite the performance." But something unexpected happened. As Clara descended the staircase, her composed demeanor seemed to unsettle the crowd. There were no signs of self-consciousness or hesitation in her step. Instead, her chin remained high, and her serene expression challenged the very atmosphere of judgment Celeste had curated. Celeste felt the first flicker of unease. She had envisioned Clara faltering, overwhelmed by the crowd's scrutiny. Instead, Clara moved with an elegance that rivaled the most practiced socialites in the room. Whispers started to circulate, not of mockery, but of curiosity. "Who is she?" one guest asked, leaning toward another. "She carries herself so regally." The seed of doubt took root in Celeste's mind. This was not going according to plan. The humiliation she had plotted was beginning to unravel, though she couldn't yet foresee just how dramatically the night would spiral out of her control. Midway through the evening, as the soft murmur of conversation buzzed around the opulent ballroom, Celeste clinked her glass, the sharp sound cutting through the chatter like a knife. Instantly, the crowd fell silent, the flicker of candlelight casting shadows on the polished faces of the guests. All eyes turned toward her as she stood on the grand staircase, her gaze sweeping over the room with an air of controlled elegance. "I'd like to share a little secret about my dear maid, Clara," Celeste announced, her voice laced with a playful, almost mischievous edge. Her lips curled into a smile that was both charming and calculating. "You see, she's not just a maid. She's also known as the unknown angel." A gasp rippled through the room. A dozen whispered conversations broke out, some gasps filled with disbelief, others with intrigue. The phrase "unknown angel" hung in the air like a whispered legend, a title that had piqued curiosity across the city for months. It was a moniker that promised untold wealth and mysterious acts of kindness. Yet no one had ever glimpsed the face behind the legend. Clara, standing at the edge of the room, stiffened. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her glass, but her expression remained as unreadable as ever. She refused to let her composure slip, even as the spotlight shifted to her. "Yes," Celeste continued, her voice now tinged with a mixture of admiration and mockery. "The mysterious philanthropist who's been making headlines for her anonymous donations. Isn't it fascinating that someone so unassuming could be so generous?" The room buzzed with whispers. Some guests exchanged knowing glances. Others leaned in to listen more closely, eager to unravel the truth behind the enigmatic woman Celeste had just revealed. Before Clara could respond, the tall figure of Sir Reginald Blake, an influential businessman known for his charity work, stepped forward. His expression was one of astonishment, his eyes wide with genuine awe. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with a deep respect as he addressed Clara directly. The entire room held its breath as Clara met Sir Reginald's gaze. For a long, uncomfortable moment, she said nothing, her calm demeanor belying the storm of emotions swirling within her. Finally, she gave a single, deliberate nod. "It is," she replied, her voice soft but unmistakably clear. The room erupted into applause, the sound of clapping mingling with astonished gasps. The once quiet whispers grew louder, each guest eager to voice their praise and gratitude. The spotlight had now fully shifted, and the center of attention was no longer Celeste. It was Clara, the very woman Celeste had intended to humiliate. "You funded the hospital in Oak Ridge," exclaimed Lady Violet, her voice thick with admiration. "Do you know how many lives you've saved with that contribution?" "And the scholarships," another guest added, their tone laden with awe. "You've given so many young people a future, a chance to rise beyond their circumstances." The air was thick with praise, yet Clara remained a statue at the center of it all. Her cheeks flushed faintly, but she stood tall, every inch the poised, elusive benefactor the world had come to revere. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm was brewing. Celeste's smug expression began to falter, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the room shift. For a fleeting moment, she appeared rattled, her flawless facade cracking just enough for those nearby to notice. The applause had turned from a moment of mockery to one of true admiration, and Celeste's calculated move to expose Clara had backfired spectacularly. The guests surrounded Clara now, bombarding her with questions, seeking to get closer, to hear her story. Celeste stood in the background, her smile now a tight, frozen thing, unable to suppress the bitter taste of jealousy that rose in her throat. But just as the room began to settle into its new fascination with Clara, an unexpected voice rang out from across the room, one that was filled with unmistakable skepticism. "And what of the rumors, Miss Clara?" came a new voice, a younger man, tall and striking in his dark suit. "The rumors that you've been hiding not just your identity, but your intentions as well. Some say you've made more than just charitable donations, that you've been playing a dangerous game with the city's elite." The crowd quieted, turning toward him. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the man, Julian Westbrook, an ambitious journalist with a reputation for stirring controversy. He had spent the last few months investigating the so-called unknown angel, and his probing questions had made him a dangerous adversary. Celeste's eyes flicked toward Clara, a spark of malice now evident in her expression. She knew all too well how much trouble Clara could cause if the right questions were asked. But Clara, ever the enigma, remained unfazed. With a deliberate slowness, she turned her gaze to Julian. "I don't play games, Mr. Westbrook," she said coolly, her voice low but unwavering. "I simply do what I believe is right." The room fell into an uneasy silence, but the air was charged with an electric tension. Julian, undeterred by Clara's response, took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "But what if your actions have consequences far beyond what you realize? What if your good deeds are part of a far darker agenda?" he pressed, his voice carrying the weight of his accusation. For the briefest of moments, Clara's composure slipped. Her eyes flickered with something dangerously close to doubt. But then, just as quickly, her mask returned. She smiled faintly, a subtle tilt to her head as she regarded the room. "If you want to believe that," she said softly, "I can't stop you." The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between the allure of Clara's mystery and the nagging feeling that something was amiss. Celeste, realizing she had lost control of the situation, turned on her heel, retreating into the shadows as the murmurs began anew. But in that moment, Clara knew her secret was no longer hers alone. The revelation was just the beginning, and with Julian Westbrook's sharp eyes on her, the real game had only just begun. As the evening wore on and the guests began to trickle out, the once bustling ballroom grew quieter. The soft strains of the orchestra had long since faded, replaced by the rhythmic clinking of glasses and the occasional murmur of retreating footsteps. Celeste stood near the dessert table, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a delicate crystal bowl filled with plump strawberries, the remnants of an evening that had not gone as planned. Her grand spectacle had backfired spectacularly. Instead of diminishing Clara's reputation, it had elevated her to a status Celeste had never intended. The whispers of admiration for Clara, the unknown angel, still hung in the air like an invisible fog. Celeste, once the darling of the social scene, now found herself standing in the shadows, humiliated by the very person she had sought to expose. She hadn't anticipated this turn of events. Not once had she considered that Clara might respond with grace, might stand before the crowd and reveal herself with such quiet dignity. The applause still echoed in her ears, and the praise that had once been her due was now a bitter reminder of her failure. Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass of champagne, but before she could take a sip, she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching from behind. She turned to find Clara standing there, her expression calm, her eyes unreadable. "I didn't want this to come out like this," Clara said, her voice gentle yet firm. "But perhaps it's for the best. There's a lesson here, for both of us." Celeste opened her mouth to retort, but the words caught in her throat. Clara's presence, so serene and composed, seemed to fill the space between them, challenging her to face something she had long avoided. Instead of the confrontation Celeste had expected, she felt a knot of unease settle in her chest. "Lesson?" Celeste repeated, her voice shaky, betraying her confusion. "You've humiliated me in front of everyone, and now you're talking about lessons." Clara's eyes softened, and for the first time that evening, she stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't intend to humiliate you, Celeste. I never wanted that. But you pushed me into a corner, and when I found myself there, I realized something important. You've spent your whole life building walls around yourself, hiding behind your wealth and status. But true strength, true power, doesn't come from hiding. It comes from facing the truth." Celeste blinked, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure, but the rawness in Clara's words cut deeper than she could have ever anticipated. "Why would someone like you choose to work as a maid?" Celeste finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, tinged with something that felt almost like vulnerability. "You could have anything: money, power, freedom. You could be with people who admire you, people who appreciate you for your generosity. Why choose this life?" Clara smiled faintly, the corners of her lips curving upward with a quiet sadness. "Because I wanted to live a life grounded in humility," she replied. "Wealth isn't about money, Celeste. It's about how much good you can do with it. It's about using what you have, whatever that may be, to make a difference, to leave a mark that matters." Her words hung in the air like a weight, sinking into Celeste's consciousness with a quiet force. There was no smugness, no self-righteousness in Clara's tone, just an undeniable truth that Celeste could no longer ignore. For a long moment, Celeste stood there, her breath shallow, her thoughts spiraling. She had always prided herself on her ability to manipulate, to control her world with the strength of her wealth and influence. She had built her life on appearances, on being the woman others envied, admired, and feared. But now, standing in front of Clara, it all felt hollow, empty. Her fingers gripped the champagne glass harder, the crystal beginning to feel like an anchor to her old self. "You make it sound so simple," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "As if I've been doing everything wrong." Clara tilted her head, her eyes softening with understanding. "I'm not saying that, Celeste, but sometimes it takes a moment like this, a jolt to your world, to see what's been missing. You've spent so much of your life chasing after things that don't matter in the end. Maybe it's time to ask yourself what truly does." Celeste's breath caught in her throat, the weight of Clara's words pressing down on her chest. A tight knot formed in her stomach, and she could feel the walls she had so carefully constructed around her life begin to crack. This wasn't just a confrontation about charity or generosity. It was about everything Celeste had built her life upon: the facades, the manipulation, the ruthless pursuit of status. The silence between them stretched on, both women standing on the precipice of something unspoken, something deeper than either had anticipated. But just as Celeste opened her mouth to respond, the moment was shattered by the sound of footsteps approaching from across the room. Julian Westbrook, the journalist who had stirred the pot earlier, had returned. His presence seemed almost predatory now, his eyes scanning the room with a new, sharper intensity. He caught sight of Celeste and Clara and made his way toward them, a thin smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Ah, the two women of the hour?" Julian said, his tone laced with irony. "What an interesting turn of events. A maid turned philanthropist, a hostess who thought she could pull the strings and ended up caught in her own trap." Celeste stiffened, her defenses rising at the sight of him. She opened her mouth to dismiss him, but Clara raised a hand, silencing her. "I'm afraid you've misread this, Mr. Westbrook," Clara said coolly, her tone a stark contrast to the tension in the room. "The trap isn't mine. It's one you're all too eager to walk into. You've been so focused on the wrong things, Mr. Westbrook. The rumors, the secrets, the scandals. You think they define people, but they don't. They never will." Julian's smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. But before he could respond, Clara turned to Celeste once more, her gaze intense. "Perhaps this is your wake-up call, Celeste," Clara said quietly, but with a piercing clarity. "The world doesn't revolve around you, and maybe, just maybe, it's time for you to change the story." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Celeste standing there, lost, unsure, and painfully aware of how much her world had shifted. The evening had unraveled in ways neither of them had expected. But in the silence that followed Clara's departure, something new began to stir within Celeste. Whether she could face it or not, the truth had been revealed. In the weeks that followed, the lingering taste of defeat from that fateful night began to seep into every corner of Celeste's life. The once constant hum of her extravagant existence, where everything was measured by the wealth in her bank account and the guests at her parties, had become hollow. The applause for Clara, the unknown angel, echoed in her ears, and no matter how hard Celeste tried to push it away, the words Clara had spoken rang true in her mind. "True wealth isn't about money, Celeste. It's about how much good you can do with it." It was an uncomfortable truth, one that Celeste had tried to ignore for years. She had always prided herself on her ability to curate a life of luxury, one where appearances were everything and the world adored her. But Clara had shattered that illusion with a simple, honest smile. The revelation had been like a jolt to her system, a moment that had forced her to face a side of herself she had long suppressed: her greed, her obsession with status, and the emptiness that filled the spaces between her designer suits and her expensive champagne. The change didn't come overnight. It was slow, like the gradual softening of stone under the pressure of water. Celeste found herself questioning everything she had ever believed in. The guilt gnawed at her every time she entered her grand mansion, her eyes falling on the stacks of untouched charity checks and the piles of glamorous invitations. It all seemed so irrelevant now. One rainy afternoon, Celeste sat in her study, staring at her reflection in the polished surface of her desk. Her mind wandered back to Clara's quiet words. She had been wrong about so much. The way she had manipulated her life, the way she had built her identity on fleeting accolades and the admiration of the elite. It all felt so fragile now. But Clara had a strength that Celeste had never understood until that moment. It wasn't in her wealth, her beauty, or her status. It was in her ability to give without expecting anything in return. That evening, Celeste made a decision. She reached for the phone and dialed the number of a local shelter, one that had been on her radar for some time, but which she had never visited. She wanted to know more, to see how she could contribute, to begin using her position to do more than just host parties and throw lavish dinners. She needed to make a difference, not for the sake of appearances, but for herself. The following days were filled with a new kind of busyness. Celeste began to spend more time away from her home, immersing herself in the lives of those she had once ignored. She volunteered at homeless shelters, worked with organizations helping at-risk youth, and met with activists striving to combat poverty and injustice. It wasn't easy. Her initial discomfort was palpable. The world she was stepping into was raw, unpolished, and far less glamorous than the world she had been a part of. But with every interaction, with every person she helped, something inside her began to shift. She used her family's wealth in ways she never had before, funneling donations into causes she believed in rather than using it as a means to maintain her lifestyle. She sponsored scholarships for underprivileged children, funded medical research, and even organized charity galas to raise awareness for issues she had once overlooked. It wasn't about showing off her generosity. It was about making a real difference. Slowly but surely, she found herself waking up with purpose, something that had been missing from her life for years. At first, Celeste expected to feel fulfilled in the same way she had with her extravagant parties and designer outfits. But the sense of fulfillment was different this time. It wasn't about the attention or the recognition. It was about the quiet, tangible impact she was making. She began to see that her true wealth wasn't in the size of her home or the brands she wore, but in the lives she touched. It was in the smile of a child who now had a scholarship, in the relief of a family receiving assistance after losing their home, in the thank you notes from volunteers and staff members who saw her as someone who truly cared. Meanwhile, Clara's presence in Celeste's life grew more and more distant. After the unveiling, Clara had quietly moved to another city, continuing her philanthropic work without fanfare or the attention that Celeste had once assumed was necessary. It was just as Clara had said that night. Her work was never about recognition. She didn't seek the spotlight. She sought change, and in the months that followed, Clara's name became a quiet legend, one that Celeste could no longer escape, no matter how hard she tried. Clara's selflessness had shown Celeste what true wealth looked like, and now Celeste couldn't ignore the lesson that had reshaped her life. One afternoon, as Celeste stood in the community center she had helped fund, watching a group of children laugh as they created artwork for an upcoming charity auction, she found herself reflecting on how far she had come. She wasn't the same person who had stood by that dessert table, bitter and proud, her world crumbling under the weight of her own vanity. She had changed, and it was more than just the charities she had supported or the checks she had written. It was the way she saw the world now, through a lens of empathy and responsibility. Clara's quiet influence was still with her. She couldn't help but think of her often, of the way Clara had smiled, not with arrogance, but with quiet pride in the good she was doing. Celeste had come to realize that true wealth was not about what you could accumulate, but about what you could give. True wealth was the legacy you left behind in the lives of others, the impact you made by lifting others up rather than stepping on them to get ahead. And in that moment, standing in the light of the new life she was creating, Celeste finally understood the lesson Clara had taught her: to find peace, fulfillment, and purpose in giving, not in receiving.